Well, here we come to our Sunday school lesson for Palm Sunday, April the 10th. And before we jump into the lesson today, I wanted to take a few minutes and just talk about Holy Week. It's such an important week in our Christian faith. And I think so often what we do is we go to Palm Sunday, we watch the children come in waving palms, and we talk about the triumphal entry, and we celebrate that event. And then our minds immediately jump to Easter. We think about Easter and celebrating with the family, and maybe taking a trip, going for a weekend, going somewhere, but time together. But I think when we do that, we cheat ourselves, and I really want to encourage you this week, even if you normally don't do a daily devotional, to take time to really look and reflect on the events of Holy Week. I think about it. I think about it a lot, because I think about what that must have been like for Jesus, what that must have been like. That here he was in his last week of life on earth, fully human and fully divine. I mean, he was going to experience pain and shame, failure, criticism. Nearly a third of the Gospels is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life. Only 2 of the Gospels mention the events of his birth, but all 4 offer a few pages on the resurrection. But each Gospel gives a detailed account of his death, because nothing had remotely happened like that before. Now, there had been celestial beings seen before the incarnation, but how could a Messiah face defeat? How could God get crucified? Nature itself convulsed at the act. At the crucifixion, we remember that the ground shook, the rocks cracked open, the sky grew black. And just consider the sheer drama of the whole event. Here was the most sophisticated religious system of the time, allied with the most powerful empire against one solitary figure, the only perfect man who ever lived. And the Gospels give us this strong, ironic sense that he is overseeing the whole process. His goal all along was the cross. He lived for his first 30 years as a carpenter, we know that, and I consider that, I think about that, I think about what that must have been like. We talked a week ago or 2 weeks ago about, how do you see Jesus? When you think about Jesus, when you hear the name Jesus, what do you think about? What is your first images? And I think about the image of Jesus laughing. We've got a picture on the wall in our classroom of Jesus laughing. He laughed. He went to banquets. He attended celebrations. He obviously was a very engaging person because people loved to listen to him. Children loved him. He must have been a great person. He must have been very kind and gentle. Children don't like a grump, and yet children migrated toward Jesus because they wanted to hear what he had to say. And we read also about how he was close to his mother. He was close to his brothers. He must have been fun to be around. But one day when he was in his carpenter shop, he probably turned around and he looked in the mirror. And instead of his face, he saw yours. He saw mine. He knew that we couldn't stand the pain, the burden, the anguish of life without him. And he knew that it was time to hang up his apron, walk out the door, and begin his ministry. He just couldn't bear the thought of you and me handling our burdens alone. And so I want to take a few minutes before we actually get into the lesson itself, and I want to consider some of the events that take place during Holy Week and that we think about and we reflect on. Now, first of all, Jesus typically shied away from attention and acclaim. Remember the number of times in the scriptures where Jesus tells his disciples, don't talk about this to anybody. Don't share what you just witnessed with anybody. But here were thousands of pilgrims gathered for Passover. Now, I've mentioned before the historian Josephus, and Josephus gives us an idea of how many pilgrims actually were there for this 7-week Passover event. He tells us that the governor of Palestine, roughly in 65 AD, was trying to convince Nero of the importance of the Jewish religion. And so he asked the high priest to take a census on how many lambs were sacrificed, slain at the Passover. The number, and this was amazing when I read this, the number according to Josephus was 256,500 lambs were slain. And the law that was there at the time, that it was a minimum party of 10 people per lamb. So that means there must have been over 3 million pilgrims gathered for the Passover feast. And so the last act of Jesus' life was to be played out in a city crammed with Jews who had come from all over to commemorate the event of their release from Egypt's slavery decades ago. And it was at this very time that God's deliverer of mankind was going to be crucified on the cross. There was a group from Bethany there who had witnessed Lazarus' miracle. The group from Galilee who knew him well. Matthew points out that there was further support there from the blind, the lame, and the children. And within that group were Roman legions that were there for crowd control. There were religious authorities who hated Jesus. And we well know that according to Luke, as Jesus approached the gates, he wept. This was not a Roman procession, a conquering general on a chariot of gold, followed by a lot of Roman soldiers with captured flags and prisoners in chains to testify to the power of Rome. But this was a Messiah on a borrowed donkey who wept. Now I want to go and read the lesson from Mark. This takes place just after the Last Supper. And we will gather together and we will commemorate the Last Supper on Maundy Thursday. And one of the things that I would encourage you to do, and I said when you go through this week and you take time to reflect on Holy Week, look at the passage in John 13 through 17. And this gives us such an intimate memoir of Jesus and his last night on earth. And probably one of the most significant things that happened. And again, remember, he's trying to share with the apostles the important things that he wants them to remember. And after the meal, he got up and he washed their feet because he wanted to impress upon them the importance of being a servant, of being a servant leader. And so let's go to our lesson in Mark. It's Mark 14, 27 through 42. The purpose statement of our lesson is to ponder ways in which disciples today, like Jesus' disciples, often miss the mark. And so we're going to read, I'm reading from my Wesley Study Bible. It says, Jesus said to them, "You will falter in your faithfulness to me. It is written, I will hit the shepherd, and the sheep will go off in all directions. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even if everyone else stumbles, I won't." But Jesus said to him, "I assure you that on this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter insisted, "If I must die alongside you, I won't deny you." And they all said the same thing. Then Jesus and his disciples came to a place called Gethsemane. Jesus said to them, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to feel despair and was anxious. He said to them, "I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Stay here and keep alert." Then he went a short distance further and fell to the ground. He prayed that if possible he might be spared the time of suffering. He said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want." He came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Couldn't you stay alert for 1 hour? Stay alert and pray so that you won't give in to temptation. The spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak." Again he left them and prayed, repeating the same words. And again when he came back, he found them sleeping, for they couldn't keep their eyes open, and they didn't know how to respond to him. He came a 3rd time and said to them, "Will you sleep and rest all night? That's enough. The time has come for the human one to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let's go. Look, here comes my betrayer." Think about that. Think about God sharing with the people that are closest to him, the apostles and disciples that he spent the last 3 years with. It's a tremendous thing about Jesus that there was nothing for which he was not prepared. The opposition, the misunderstanding, the hatred of the Orthodox Jewish people, the betrayal by one of his own inner circle, the pain, the agony of the cross, he was prepared for them all. But perhaps what hurt him the most was the failure of his friends. It's when we're up against something that we just can't possibly handle on our own that we need our friends most. And that was exactly when Jesus' friends left him alone and let him down. Jesus had this ability, however, to always remain erect. No matter what blows assaulted him, he had this serenity about him. He had this caring about him. When there was nothing but heartbreak behind and torture in front, he had this amazing ability to still be our hero. When Jesus foretold this tragic failure of loyalty, Peter couldn't believe it. He said, it's not going to happen. Not to me. I won't let that happen to you. Now there was a lesson that when I read Barclay and I was looking at this lesson, I found this was interesting. And he said the word fall away, when he talks about the disciples falling away, the Greek verb is skelendazine, which meant bait in a trap. Think of a mouse trap. The stick, the little piece of wood that is there for the piece of cheese on it, the animal was lured in, the mouse is lured in, and then the snap traps them as soon as they step on it. And so this word means to be entrapped. They'll fall away. They'll put themselves in a position to be entrapped or to be tripped up by some trick. Peter was so sure of himself. And what he had forgotten, and what sometimes we forget, is that traps that life can lay before even the strongest of people. He had forgotten that the best of people can step on a slippery place and fall. I think about my life. I look back, I reflect on my life, and sometimes when I got the most confident, when I got the most sure of myself, God would step in and say, wait a minute, I got to give you something to think about here. Because it's in those moments that we let our guard down, we start relying on ourselves. And we're going to have things that are going to happen. And we talk about Peter. It's familiar to all of us that before the cock crowed 3 times that Peter would deny him. And we want to be critical of Peter. We also know that later Peter was reinstated, because there's one important thing to remember about Peter. His heart was in the right place. What he was saying was out of love for Christ. I'm not going to let that happen to you. I love you. I love you. I've been with you. Remember, Christ said that it was on Peter was the rock on which the church was going to be built. He had this heart of love, even if that love failed him at a particular moment. And it was certainly better for that love to fail him at that moment than what Judas did. Judas, with his cold heart of hate, sold out Christ. I think it's interesting, somebody pointed out that after that night that Judas betrayed Christ, that no one ever again was named Judas. I thought about that, and they're right. I've never known anybody that wanted to name their child Judas. So we can condemn Peter, but on the other hand, he was not disloyal because of lack of love. Peter loved Jesus, and even if it failed, we know it rose again. And then our passage goes to Gethsemane. It's almost a passage that we hate to read, the last part of this passage. If Jesus had stayed in the upper room, it would have been dangerous. The authorities were on the watch for him. We know that story because of Judas. Judas was bent on treachery. And the upper room could have been raided at any time. But Jesus had another place that he could go. The fact that Judas knew to look for him in Gethsemane shows that Jesus was probably in the habit of going there on a regular basis. Now in Jerusalem, there were no gardens. The city was too crowded for gardens, and there was this strange law that I read about that said that no one could have a garden because you couldn't put manure on soil in Jerusalem. And so some of the richer people possessed private gardens out on the Mount of Olives, where they went, they visited, they rested. And so Jesus probably had some friend, some wealthy friend, who gave him the privilege of using his garden at night. And think about why he went to Gethsemane. Jesus went for two things that he was looking for. He wanted human fellowship, and he wanted God's fellowship. He didn't want to be alone. I mean, we read in Genesis that it is not good that man should be alone. God said in the beginning to us. In times of trouble, we want someone with us. It could be that we want somebody there, and we talk about the ministry of presence, not to tell us what to do, not to agree with us, not to disagree with us, but just to be there. I think about how important that is. I think about when, and we're all, and I say this often, we're all a product of our life experiences. I've shared before that my first job as a 16-year-old, I begged the administrator at the hospital to hire me. I thought at one time I wanted to be a physician. And what better way to learn about being a physician than working at a hospital? And so for years, from the time I was 16 until I was old enough to, when I was in college, get my real estate license, I worked at the hospital on weekends, on breaks from school. And I loved it. I loved that. But one of the first things I learned was how important it was just to be present with people. How people just, when you are experiencing any kind of a situation, you just want somebody there with you. You just want to know that there's somebody that cares enough just to be by your side. And Jesus was like that. And think about how strange this had to be that here were people that in such a short period of time, the people that were closest to him, people that said they were going to die for him, could not even stay awake for one single hour. Now, to be fair, I mean, think about all that had happened. Think about the whole experience of being with all these people and Jesus trying to explain to him about the crucifixion and going to the cross and trying to impart upon them all the important things he wanted to say. They had to be exhausted. But there's certain things that I think are clear about Jesus in this passage that we need to reflect on. He didn't want to die. In his humanity, he didn't want to leave. He was 33. And if we think about our lives, no one wants to give up their life on earth that quickly. He had done so little and there was so much more that he could do. There were so many people waiting to be saved that he wanted to get to. He knew what crucifixion was like. He had seen crucifixion. And he didn't want to have to go through that. He had to compel himself to go on. And isn't that true with us? There's times that we face something that seems so difficult, and yet we have to kind of use the term suck it up and just get on with it. Just deal with it. We don't want to, but we don't have a choice. I think it's also true in this passage that we see that Jesus didn't fully understand why it had to be. He only knew beyond a doubt that it was the will of God and that he must go on. Jesus, too, had to make this great venture of faith that we're asked to make at different times. He had to accept, as we so often have to do, what he couldn't understand, but he had to carry on. And I think the third thing, and I think this is one of the most beautiful things in this passage, is when he submitted to the will of God, he used the term Abba. Abba, translated today, means daddy. I think about my mother. My mother always called her father daddy. When you call somebody daddy, that's special, because that's somebody that's close to you. That's somebody you rely on. When you think about your father, your earthly father, there's somebody that when it came down to something challenging that you wanted to talk about, something you wanted to do, you wanted daddy. Daddy was your strength. And in that one word, it made all the difference, because Jesus was turning to his strength. Even in this terrible hour, when he had this terrible burden on him, he knew that God was Father. And if we can call God Father, everything becomes bearable. If we have that kind of a daddy-Abba relationship, everything becomes bearable. Time and again we won't understand, but we will be certain that the Father's hand will never cause his child a needless fear. That is what Jesus knew. That is why he could go on. And it can be so with us. Think about how this passage ends, and we're going to finish with this. The traitor, the gang had arrived. And what was Jesus' reaction? It was not to run away. Not even to think about running away into the night. It would have been easy to try to escape, to hide. But his reaction was, I need to face them. To the end, he would never turn aside nor turn back. And that's what he is to us. We have challenges, we have fears, we have things that we don't know how we're going to handle. But we know we need to face them. We need to face them, we need to go on. But we know that God, Jesus, is going to be with us. Will you pray with me, my friends? Our gracious Heavenly Father, we just come to you today thankful. Thankful for these words. Thankful for this message. Thankful for the time that you give each one of us to reflect on Holy Week and the importance of Holy Week in our lives. We're going to face challenges. We know we're going to face challenges. But we know that you're there and you're going to be there with us. We ask that as we go throughout this week, we continue to keep our eyes open to the things you want us to see, our ears open to the things you want us to hear, and our hearts overflowing with love, that love that you have put in each and every one of us. In his name we pray. Amen. I love you, my friends, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.